My son-in-law gave me 48 hours to leave the house where my daughter grew up. He said it kindly, which somehow made it worse, and I let him believe he had that right because I'd been keeping a secret for 22 years. I'm going to tell you the whole thing. I think you deserve to know how it really happened. My daughter Elise was diagnosed in February. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, moving fast. She was 34 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and a laugh that could fill a room. The doctors gave us 6 to 8 months. She made it to 7. I spent those 7 months driving back and forth between my place in Tucson and the house in Phoenix, the house on Maplecroft Lane that she and her husband Damon had been living in for the past 5 years. I brought groceries. I sat with her when Damon was at work. I read to her when the medication made it hard for her to focus. I did not complain once because there was nothing to complain about. She was my daughter. There was nowhere else I would have been. Damon was not a bad man in the beginning. When they first got married, he was polite enough. Attentive. He had a good job in sales, made decent money, drove a nice truck. He and Elise seemed happy. I didn't ask too many questions. You learn not to when your kids grow up. But over those 7 months I watched something change in him. It was subtle at first. The way he'd leave early in the morning and come back after she'd already fallen asleep. The way he stopped sitting with her at dinner. The way he talked about the future in a tone that didn't include her in it. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief makes you paranoid. Maybe he was processing it differently. People do. The week after Elise passed, I was still in the house. I was sleeping in the guest room, the same one I'd stayed in every time I visited. Her things were still everywhere. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, a cardigan on the hook by the back door. I couldn't look at it too long without my chest tightening up, but I also couldn't leave. Not yet. I wasn't ready. Damon came to me on a Tuesday evening. He sat down at the kitchen table across from me, with the look of someone who'd rehearsed what they were about to say. He told me he appreciated everything I'd done. He told me the house was going to feel different now, and he needed space to figure out his next steps. He said he thought it would be best if I found somewhere else to stay, and that he wanted to be respectful, so he was giving me until Thursday. Thursday. 2 days. While I was still in the clothes I'd worn to my daughter's funeral. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about saying a dozen different things. Instead, I asked if he wanted coffee. He said no. I said okay. And I went back to the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed until it got dark outside. I called my brother-in-law, Reggie, that night. He lives over in Mesa, about 20 minutes away. I told him what Damon had said. There was silence on his end, and then a slow exhale. And then he told me I could come stay with him as long as I needed. I said I'd think about it. I didn't call anyone else. I didn't want to explain it over and over. I was 61 years old. I'd just lost my only child, and I was being asked to pack my bags by a man who'd never paid a single utility bill in that house. Not one. But he didn't know that. Here's what I need to tell you. Here's the part that I kept to myself for 22 years, ever since Elise was 12 years old, and I bought that house on Maplecroft Lane. My late wife, Carol, Elise's mother, passed when Elise was 10. Ovarian cancer. Quick and brutal, the way it sometimes is. I was left alone with a little girl who needed stability more than anything. So I worked. I worked construction for 20 years, and I saved everything I didn't spend. When a house 2 streets over from where we were renting came up for sale, I bought it, cash. Paid $178,000 for it in 2003. It needed work, but it had a yard and good bones, and it was ours. Elise grew up in that house. She learned to ride a bike in the driveway. She had a 16th birthday party in the backyard. She brought Damon to Thanksgiving dinner in that dining room for the first time, and I sat across from him and tried to figure out what kind of man he was. When they got married and started talking about where they'd live, Elise asked if they could stay in the house. She said it felt like home. She said she wanted her kids to grow up there someday. I said yes without hesitating. I never told Damon it was my house. Elise knew. She'd always known. But she asked me once, early on in their marriage, if we could just keep it between us for a while. She didn't explain why, exactly. She said she just didn't want money to become a thing between her and Damon. I understood. Or I thought I did. So the house stayed in my name. I paid the property taxes every year. I covered the insurance. When the water heater went out in 2019, I wrote the check. When they needed a new roof after a hailstorm, I handled it. Damon thought Elise was taking care of all of it from her salary. She let him believe that because she was protecting something. I don't know if it was him or herself or the marriage or all three, and I went along with it. Because it was her life and her choice, and she wasn't hurting anyone. Until she died. And then it became my problem. I left on Thursday morning, like he asked. I put my bag in my truck, and I took one last walk through the house. I stood in the kitchen where I'd taught Elise to make her grandmother's cornbread. I stood in the hallway where there used to be a growth chart penciled on the doorframe before Damon painted over it. I stood in the backyard and looked at the old oak tree that had been there longer than any of us. Damon was standing in the doorway when I came back inside. He had his arms crossed. He said, "I appreciate your understanding." He said it like he was closing a business transaction. I picked up my keys off the counter. I said, "Damon, you were good to her in the beginning. I hope you remember that version of yourself." He didn't answer. I walked out to my truck and I drove to Reggie's house. Now here's where I need to back up and explain something, because this is the part that's going to sound strange until you understand the full picture. I'm not a wealthy man. I worked construction my whole life. I retired at 58 with a pension and Social Security, and I get by fine. But I'm not the kind of man who throws numbers around. What I am is careful. I have been careful with money since I was 22 years old and learned what happens when you're not. My father lost everything when I was a teenager. The house, the business, all of it. And I swore to myself I would never be in that position. So I saved. Every tax return. Every bonus. Every side job I ever took. Over the years, some of those savings went into a small piece of land outside Prescott that a buddy of mine sold me for below market rate in 2011. I held on to it. Then the area started growing, and a developer came calling in 2021, and I sold it for more than I ever expected, enough that my accountant told me to sit down before he gave me the number. So when Damon assumed I was some old man with nothing but a pension and nowhere to go, he wasn't entirely wrong about the pension. He was very wrong about everything else. I stayed at Reggie's for 3 weeks. I helped him with some yard work. I slicked a lot. I went through a box of Elise's things that I'd brought with me, her journals from middle school, a ribbon she won in a 6th grade science fair, a birthday card she'd made for me when she was 7 that said, "Happy Birthday, Daddy," in crayon. I kept that one. My attorney, a man I'd worked with for 15 years named Whitfield, sharp guy, no nonsense, based in Scottsdale, had already drawn up the estate documents. Elise and I had talked through them together about 3 months before she passed. She was clear about what she wanted. She was very clear. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday, 3 weeks after the funeral. Damon showed up in a jacket and tie. He brought a woman with him. She sat in the waiting area while he came into the conference room. I was already there when he arrived. He looked surprised to see me, which told me everything about what he thought my role in any of this was. Whitfield read through the documents in his usual methodical way. He didn't rush. He covered Elise's personal belongings, some accounts in her name, a small life insurance policy. Then he got to the property. He read the address. He explained that the property at Maplecroft Lane was not, and had never been, part of Elise's estate, as it was not titled in her name. He explained that the property was owned outright by me. He explained that Elise had left a letter, which he then read aloud, in which she thanked Damon for the years they had together and explained that she'd always known the house belonged to her father and that she hoped everyone would move forward with grace. Damon went very still. Whitfield finished reading and set the papers down. He asked if there were any questions. Damon turned to me. His jaw was tight. He said, "You own the house." I said, "I've owned it for 22 years. He said, "And you let me believe." I said, "And you let me believe anything. I just didn't correct you." He asked me what I was going to do with it. His voice had an edge to it. Not angry exactly. More like a man who's just realized he's been standing on ice and is trying to figure out how thick it is. I told him I'd be moving back in by the end of the month. I told him he was welcome to take his time collecting his belongings because I'm not the kind of man who gives people 48 hours. I told him I hoped he and the woman in the waiting area had a good life somewhere that suited them. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he looked down at the table. He said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's sort of the point." He left without saying anything else. I moved back into the house on a Saturday in mid-October. Reggie helped me carry some boxes in. We ordered pizza and ate it on the back patio. And I looked up at that old oak tree in the fading light. And I thought about Elise. I thought about her at 12, climbing up the lower branches and thinking she was invincible. I thought about her at 20, sitting on the back steps with me the night before she left for college, telling me she was scared and excited and that she was going to be okay. I thought about her at 34 in the last weeks, when she'd sometimes reach over and squeeze my hand without saying anything because some things don't need words. I thought about the fact that she was the one who asked me to keep the secret, and I've spent some time sitting with that. Would it have been better if we'd been upfront about it from the beginning? Maybe. Probably. But she made a choice, and she had her reasons, and she was a grown woman who knew her own marriage better than I did. I respected that when she was alive. I'm not going to second-guess her now. There were things about Damon that came out later. My son-in-law, former son-in-law now, I suppose, had been spending money in ways that Elise never fully knew about. A friend of hers told me, a few months later, that Elise had found credit card statements that didn't make sense, that there had been arguments about it that she'd kept private because she was sick and she didn't have the energy for a battle on that front. I don't know the full story, and I won't pretend to, but I know that for 5 years, Damon lived in a house where someone else paid every bill, and he never once asked why his wife seemed to handle everything so effortlessly. He just let it be easy and called himself a provider. There's something about that particular kind of blindness that gets to me more than the anger does. I spent that first winter back in the house doing some repairs I'd been putting off. Repainted the front door, replaced the porch railing, got the oak tree looked at by an arborist who said it was healthier than it looked. I planted some things in the back garden that Elise would have liked. Lavender, rosemary, a small fig tree because she used to steal figs off the neighbor's tree as a kid, and thought no one knew. I didn't try to turn it into a museum. That's the thing about grief that people don't always tell you. There's a version of it that becomes a kind of hoarding. You keep everything exactly as it was because changing anything feels like forgetting. But that's not how it works. You don't honor someone by freezing their absence. You honor them by staying alive in the space they loved. So I changed some things. I moved some furniture. I put her photos in frames instead of leaving them in boxes. I made it a place where a living person lives, not a memorial to someone who's gone. Reggie comes over most Sundays. We watch football and I make a pot of chili that my wife used to make, the recipe she got from her grandmother, and that I eventually learned by standing next to her in this kitchen enough times to memorize it without meaning to. Sometimes I walk through the house in the evening when the light is low and it gets quiet, and I think about all the years that happened inside these walls. My wife bringing Elise home from the hospital. Elise's first day of kindergarten. Christmas mornings. Ordinary Tuesdays that didn't feel significant at the time, but that I can still see clearly if I close my eyes. Damon never asked me why. He never asked why I'd kept it secret, or why I'd stayed quiet when he told me to leave, or what I was thinking that Thursday morning when I picked up my keys off that counter. I think he assumed he knew the answer, that I was a beaten-down old man who had no other options, that I left because I had no choice. But I had plenty of choices. I just chose to wait for the right moment to use them. There's a lesson in there somewhere. I'm not going to wrap it up too neatly because life isn't neat. But if I had to say it plainly, be careful about the people you underestimate, the ones who don't raise their voice, the ones who keep their paperwork in order, the ones who've been paying attention long after you stopped expecting them to. The house on Maplecroft Lane is mine. It always was, it always will be, and that oak tree in the backyard. The arborist says it's probably got another 50 years in it. I plan to enjoy every one of them. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking at it from different angles, and the thing that keeps coming back to me isn't the will reading, or the look on Damon's face, or even the moment I picked up my keys off that counter and walked out the door. What keeps coming back to me is a Tuesday evening in a kitchen, with a man sitting across from me who had made a decision about who I was, and I let him finish his sentence. That took something. Not strength in the way people usually mean it, not the loud kind, just the decision to hold still when everything in me wanted to correct him. I've been doing right by that house for 22 years. Paid the taxes. Covered the insurance. Showed up every time something broke. I didn't do any of that to hold it over anyone's head. I did it because Elise was my daughter, and that house was her home, and taking care of what matters to you is just what decent people do. That's the only moral I've got. You do right by the people you love, quietly, without keeping score, because it's the right thing, not because you're building a case. But here's what I've also learned, and it took me a long time to learn it. Doing right doesn't mean being a doormat. You can be patient and still be clear-eyed. I knew what Damon didn't know. I understood the full picture when he only had half of it. And I made a choice, a deliberate, thought-through choice, to wait. Not out of cowardice, out of something closer to wisdom, I think. There's a difference between staying quiet because you're afraid, and staying quiet because you know the right moment hasn't come yet. I spent 61 years learning that difference. The part that gets me about Damon isn't the anger. I've let that go. What gets me is that he never asked. For 5 years, he lived in a house where every bill got handled, and he never once sat down and thought, how is this working exactly? He just accepted the comfort without curiosity, and that kind of incuriosity, that willingness to receive without understanding, it catches up with you eventually. It caught up with him in a conference room on a Thursday afternoon, and there was nothing dramatic about it. Just a man going very still when the ground shifted under him. Elise kept the secret because she was protecting something. I'll never fully know what, but she was not a passive person. She made a choice, the same way I made a choice, the same way we all make choices that ripple out further than we can see. She chose to carry something quietly, and she carried it all the way to the end. I admire that, even when it complicates things, even when I sit with the question of whether it had to be that way. What I know is this: the house on Maplecroft Lane is still standing, the oak tree is still growing, and I'm still here, which on some days is the most remarkable thing of all. Elise used to say that the best revenge is just outlasting the people who underestimated you. She said it laughing, like it was a joke. But she was right, she usually was. The courage it takes to stay quiet when someone misreads you completely, that's real. The intelligence it takes to know which battles to save your energy for, that's real too. And the simple, unglamorous persistence of showing up, decade after decade, paying the bills, keeping the receipts, doing what you said you'd do, that might be the most underrated quality a person can have. I'm not a dramatic man. I never have been. But I have been careful. And careful, it turns out, compounds over time, just like anything else worth building.